Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of sources and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge to help you get well informed quickly. Imagine this. What if the very fabric of our society, the nation state as we know it, with its taxes, its rules, even its sense of national identity, is on the verge of collapsing, replaced by something entirely new and driven by technology?
That is, yeah, a truly provocative vision. And today, we're plunging into a set of really radical predictions from the book The Sovereign Individual, Mastering the Transition to the Information Age. It was written by James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg, first published way back in 1997. So this deep dive is all about unpacking their bold claims for how the information revolution will, fundamentally reshape power, wealth, and individual autonomy. Our goal really is to give you a shortcut to understanding this future they believe is already unfolding.
That's right. And to do that, the authors really cast a wide net. They draw on history, economics, and something they call megapolitics. That's a unique framework for understanding how the control of violence shapes society. They argue we're entering an unprecedented fourth stage of human social organization. So let's maybe start there with megapolitics. What exactly do they mean by that, and why is it so central to their argument?
Right, megapolitics. In their view, it's the study of those really big macro-level factors that alter the costs and rewards of projecting power. Think about it. These are the forces that fundamentally influence the rise and fall of governments, the reasons for wars, even economic prosperity. And what's crucial to their definition is the idea that violence is often at the very core of this dynamic. As they famously put it, power has always sought the readiest way to take resources.
That's a pretty stark claim, but it kind of makes sense when you look back through history. They identify four main drivers of this megapolitical change: topography, climate, microbes, and maybe most importantly for their whole thesis, technology. How do these elements factor in, especially technology?
Well, historically, all of them have played absolutely immense roles. For instance, they point to the intensely cold weather of the 17th century, where wine was literally freezing on the Sun King's table at Versailles. That wasn't just uncomfortable. This climate shift led to widespread crop failures and global revolutions.
Wow.
Or think about microbes, the devastating impact of European diseases like measles on indigenous populations when Europeans arrived. These weren't just isolated events. They fundamentally reshaped the societies, their time, the balance of power. But for the modern centuries, the authors see technology taking an increasingly prominent role, shifting that balance in ways nothing else really can.
Okay, so if these big megapolitical forces are driving change, how do the authors see history actually unfolding? Is it just one thing after another, or are there distinct stages that fundamentally reshape society?
Exactly. They argue for history unfolding in three main stages. You've got hunting and gathering, then agricultural societies, then industrial societies. And all that leads inevitably, in their view, to a looming fourth stage, information societies. And the key detail here, like you said, is their assertion that each of these stages corresponds to distinctly different phases in the evolution and control of violence. The tools of power and who gets to wield them change dramatically with each big transition.
And what triggers these massive transitions? They mention this mysterious 500-year cycle marking major turning points in Western history, which leads up to what they predicted back in '97 as a millennial transformation around the year 2000. It's pretty wild when you look at their examples.
It really is. They cite the feudal revolution around 1000 AD, which happened amidst economic and political turmoil. Then, fast forward to around 1500 AD, and you get the gunpowder revolution, the Renaissance, the Reformation, all ushering in the modern age, marked by things like new bronze cannons, Columbus sailing to America, big changes. And by their reckoning, the information revolution around 2000 AD was the next big one on that cycle, bringing us right back to their central argument.
Okay, so if these grand cycles are really playing out, what does that actually mean for the individual in this coming information age? How do they imagine people navigating such, seismic shifts?
Right. And this brings us right to their core prediction, the rise of the sovereign individual. They foresee individuals becoming, and this is their phrase, completely responsible for their own destinies, arranging their own welfare through private means. It's a really radical departure from the collectivist systems we've known for, the last century or so.
Thinking about this mobility of wealth and talent, it brings us to one of their most intriguing ideas, this cognitive elite. What exactly do they mean by that term, and how do they see them operating differently in this new age?
The cognitive elite. Well, in their words, these are the individuals with high intellectual capital who will increasingly operate outside political boundaries. They'll be equally at home, say, in global financial centers like Frankfurt, London, or Tokyo. Doesn't matter where they physically are. And the key driver here is how information technology essentially divorces income earning potential from a specific geographic location.
Yeah.
As they put it, ideas can be formulated anywhere and transmitted globally at the speed of light. It's almost
Oh.
like, the ancient Greek gods Hermes and Apollo who could just zap across distances at supernatural speed.
That sounds like an unprecedented level of freedom and a really powerful incentive, too. What's the practical impact of that kind of mobility for individuals, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as, say, taxes?
This is where their concept of exit becomes so incredibly compelling. For the first time, maybe ever on this scale, individuals won't be obliged to live in high-tax jurisdictions just to earn high incomes. The author stated pretty bluntly, governments that attempt to charge too much as the price of domicile will merely drive away their best customers.
Like voting with your feet, but on a global scale.
Exactly. It echoes that old Chinese folk wisdom they mentioned. Of all the 36 ways to get out of trouble, the best way is leave. This isn't just about personal choice. They see it as a fundamental shift in the power dynamic between the individual and the state.
And if that's the case, what happens to the governments you leave behind? The authors make a pretty stark prediction about the demise of the nation-state itself. Starting with its fiscal collapse, they argued the welfare state would become unfinanceable by 2010 or thereabouts because of, quote, disintermediation, jurisdictional and encryption problems of global computer networks.
Okay.
Now, obviously, we're past 2010, and nation-states haven't entirely vanished, but what specific elements of their reasoning did they foresee that have indeed complicated government finance, even if the, total collapse didn't happen exactly on their timeline?
That's a really good point, and it highlights the nuance here.
Yeah.
While an outright collapse might not have occurred precisely by 2010, the pressures they identified are certainly visible, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Disintermediation, for example. That just means money and transactions could increasingly flow directly between people or through new digital channels, bypassing traditional intermediaries like banks and, crucially, government oversight.
Right.
And this, combined with the complexities of global computer networks and encrypted transactions, makes it much, much harder for nation-states to track and tax wealth effectively. They believe taxing capacity could plunge by 50 to 70%. That's a dramatic shift, and it's a challenge governments are definitely grappling with today.
Yeah, to put that in historical context, William Pitt's income tax back in 1797, levied to finance the Napoleonic War, that was sort of the state beginning to take its slice. Then in the 20th century, income tax for the welfare state just exploded, right? To between 30 and 60% in many places. The authors believed the digital age would make that level of taxation just unsustainable. And it wasn't just taxes either. They predicted the end of fiat money as we know it.
Indeed, they did. They argued that new technologies would let wealth holders completely bypass national monopolies on currency. They talked about cyber money, which would be mathematically algorithm-based and crucially immune to government-induced inflation. They actually envisioned something like digital gold, uncounterfeitable, unlike fiat paper money, which they called a distinctly industrial product, mass-produced by printing presses.
And this raises a really important point for you, the listener, how inflation basically acts as a hidden tax on all who hold the currency. The authors illustrate this so vividly. They point to the U.S. dollar losing 84% of its value between 1949 and 1995, and the Argentine peso famously losing, 17 zeros between 1960 and 1991. Just staggering.
Absolutely. Their argument was that cyber money would essentially negate this hidden tax. It empowers individuals to protect their wealth from state devaluation in a way they couldn't before.
Okay, so if the state's fiscal power is shrinking, what does this all mean for its most fundamental power? Its monopoly on violence.
Yes. The authors predict a really dramatic decline in the returns to physical violence in these emerging information societies. Because, as they put it, they transcend locality. Violence is inherently local, but information, wealth, identity, they become detached from physical space.
That's a fascinating concept. If physical control, brute force, loses its edge, what replaces it? Are we really talking about an era of almost bloodless wars, as they suggest?
They certainly lean that way. They foresaw the rise of cyber soldiers, maybe deployed by very small organizations, maybe even individuals, leading to these almost bloodless information wars, fought with code rather than cannons. This is a stark contrast to the industrial age where, states having the largest coercive means tended to win wars. Big armies, big factories that made large-scale centralized violence incredibly effective. The shift in the cost-reward ratio of violence is absolutely central to their argument about the nation-state's decline.
To help us wrap our heads around this profound shift, the authors draw this really fascinating historical parallel. the decline of the medieval church. They argue the church's downfall was largely due to the gunpowder revolution and the printing press, new technologies back then, much like the nation-states' predicted decline due to microtechnology today. Can you unpack those specific parallels a bit more?
Yeah, it's a really compelling analogy they build. Think about it. The church back then had significant economic monopolies, things like alum, which was vital for textiles, and even fish. The ban on eating meat on Fridays effectively ensured a market for the church's fisheries. Smart, huh?
Oh, yeah.
But they also suffered from bureaucratic overload. They found it, and this is a quote, far easier to find people to fill church posts than to find money to pay for them. Sounds familiar.
A little bit, yeah.
And the infamous sale of indulgences for political difficulty, which the authors compared to, say, modern campaign contributions, was lucrative but ultimately unsustainable. It bred widespread resentment.
Okay, so if printing undermined the church's monopoly on knowledge and let things like Luther's heresy spread like wildfire, the analogy is clear. Just as printing subverted the church, microtechnology, in their view, will subvert the nation-state. So what kind of political entities did they see emerging from this power vacuum?
Well, as the nation-state sort of decomposes, the authors foresee the emergence of what they call competitive territorial clubs. Smaller jurisdictions, maybe city-states, enclaves, call them what you will, becoming more successful by offering competitive terms, like lower taxes or specific services, to attract individuals and capital. Sovereignty, in essence, becomes commercialized. It's up for sale.
And they give a pretty wild example, right? The Seychelles Welcome Criminals Act, where $1 million investment apparently guaranteed protection against extradition and even a diplomatic passport.
Exactly. It sounds extreme, but the authors highlight the underlying point. Services like law and order, things we traditionally think of as public goods provided by the state, will become marketable. We already see this trend with the huge growth of private security firms globally.
This also leads into their views on the fate of cities. They suggest large cities are largely an artifact of industrialism and might actually empty out as economic activity becomes location independent.
It's hard to imagine now, maybe, but they contrast London, Vienna, and Berlin's populations back in 1800, much smaller then, with their explosive growth during the industrial age, suggesting that these massive urban centers were really a product of that era, tied to factories and centralized work, not necessarily a permanent fixture.
Makes you wonder how current trends like remote work fit into that prediction, doesn't it? They also mention that high national debt, citing examples like Canada, Belgium, Italy from back then, will spur devolution and separatist movements. As regions realize they're maybe subsidizing poor areas or just unsustainable federal systems, they gave the example of the Northern League in Italy.
Right, basing his platform on the idea that northern Italy would be richer than Switzerland if it wasn't, siphoning off income to subsidize Rome and the poorer South. Whether that's true or not, it's a powerful political argument fueled by these economic pressures.
Okay, so moving to the new economic and social landscape they predicted. The authors foresee a massive shift in how work itself is structured. They talk about the decline of large, permanent firms and good jobs, which they cheekily define as jobs paying more than you're actually worth. Ouch.
Yeah. Instead, they foresee the rise of virtual corporations and project-based work with lots more independent contractors, people working for themselves, essentially.
So what does this shift away from the old industrial model actually look like in practice? Can you give us a concrete example they use to illustrate this change?
Absolutely. They contrast Adam Smith's famous example of pin manufacturers, remember that, where 18 separate operations made production incredibly efficient in the industrial age. Very specialized, very hierarchical. Now compare that to Kevin Kelly's example they cite of the Upstart car, supposedly designed by just a dozen people who outsource most of the parts. The authors see this as a fundamental shift away from the industrial era model of these huge, integrated corporations moving towards highly specialized, networked collaborations. Much more fluid.
And here's where it gets, well, pretty controversial. The authors predict rising inequality. They state flatly that information-age societies will be more unequal than those we have lived in during the 20th. That's a big statement.
It is. They use this analogy from Otto Ammon, comparing the distribution of talent to a turnip, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. They suggest that even a small rise in the skill requirements for top jobs will dramatically reduce the pool of people qualified. This could lead, they speculate, back towards a kind of feudal 100-to-1 ratio between the earnings of average workers and these sovereign individuals.
Wow, 100 to 1, that's stark. How do they justify such a prediction? Is it seen as good, bad?
They really frame this less as a moral judgment, good or bad, and more as just a natural consequence of market forces in this new age. In an information economy, they argue, rare and highly specialized skills get amplified and rewarded globally like never before. Meanwhile, less skilled labor faces way more competition from everywhere. So for them, it's about the market efficiently valuing talent rather than, say, political redistribution trying to level outcomes.
But if the nation state is declining and inequality is rising like that, what fills the vacuum left by the state's traditional role in maintaining order? This is where the authors make another really provocative claim: the rise of organized crime.
Yeah, they argue that as the nation-state's monopoly on violence breaks down, remember, violence becoming less effective for states than organized crime provides the main competition to nation-states in employing violence for predatory purposes.
It's a pretty stark vision of power decentralizing, but not necessarily into more legitimate hands. That's a powerful and, yeah, certainly provocative claim that governments themselves are basically protection rackets. Did the authors anticipate any kind of backlash to that idea, or do they offer any counterpoints to their own strong assertion?
They really don't shy away from the provocation. They pretty much imply that governments are quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy, a notion they believe will just become clearer as the state's power continues to wane.
So they just state it as fact, essentially.
Pretty much. They cite the proliferation of drug cartels, gangs, mafias, triads, even linking some high-level political figures to organized crime, using examples from the source material available back then. For them, it's just a logical consequence of violence becoming decentralized and profitable outside of state control.
With such radical shifts predicted, declining states, rising inequality, maybe more crime, a backlash seems almost inevitable, right?
Absolutely. The authors fully anticipate what they call a nationalist Luddite reaction, particularly in the currently rich welfare states, places facing declining incomes for many and these massive unfunded pension liabilities. Think about the UK. The U.S., multi-trillion-dollar unfunded liabilities that are, frankly, unlikely to ever be fully paid.
So who are these nationalist Luddites?
These are the groups who feel, justice denied. They'll cling fiercely to nationalism, to the old identities, and they'll try to use political compulsion, voting, protesting, maybe worse, to resist the changes being wrought by information technology. It's a direct parallel they draw to the original Luddites, those skilled artisans back in the Industrial Revolution whose livelihoods were threatened by new machines and who resorted to smashing them.
History repeating itself, just with a digital twist this time. But the authors don't just predict decline and backlash. They also foresee a new kind of morality emerging in the information age. They describe it as a dynamic morality, emphasizing things like productivity, efficiency, character, trustworthiness, with computer linkages, policing cyberspace to deter cheats and frauds. What does that mean exactly?
Well, this is presented as a pretty significant shift away from what they saw as the slack morality and maybe cultural relativism of the late industrial welfare state. They suggest a return to more exacting moral standards, but driven by the transparent and maybe unforgiving nature of a hyper-connected digital world. Your reputation backed by these computer linkages becomes absolutely paramount. It's about self-interest aligning with integrity in a new, technologically enforced way. Less about state rules, more about network trust.
Okay, so what's an individual supposed to do in this potentially chaotic, radically different world? The authors present a pretty clear choice: exit versus voice.
That's right. They reiterate their vision of commercialized sovereignty, where individuals express their desires primarily through exit, meaning choosing jurisdictions, choosing service providers that best suit their needs, rather than relying solely on voice, which is traditional political participation, voting, lobbying, and so on. They see exit becoming much more powerful.
And what's especially compelling is their argument for the ambitious poor. How does this affect them?
Well, new technologies, they claim, will allow individuals, particularly those in less developed regions, to essentially earn income from the locale in which one lives, but not necessarily in it, bypassing incompetent or even predatory local governments. They point to things like digital cellular phones, this was 97, remember, and wireless internet connections, making communications independent of failing local infrastructure. It potentially liberates people from the limitations of their physical location in a way that was previously impossible.
And this leads to what they call the denationalization of the individual. It sounds quite profound.
It is. The authors believe that the continuous barrage of banal messages,
Yeah.
flags, anthems, national news, that constantly reinforce national identity will weaken. It weakens as individuals increasingly operate in extranational or transnational contexts, online and off.
They offer a really thought-provoking idea here. The idea that humans must naturally place themselves in an invented community called a nation will come to be seen by the cosmopolitan elite as eccentric and unreasonable. That's a pretty powerful statement about identity itself.
It really is. And it underscores their view that national identity, which they see largely as a product of the industrial age, is becoming increasingly irrelevant for this globally mobile, sovereign individual. Finally, the authors do provide some practical steps, advice for the individual looking to achieve financial independence and navigate this transition.
Okay, like what?
Well, things like diversifying your wealth internationally,
Yeah.
considering multiple residencies or citizenships. Prioritizing privacy and encryption is huge for them. They go so far as to advise, quite starkly, you should never leave your money in any jurisdiction that claims the right to conscript you, your children, or grandchildren.
Wow.
And maybe the most famous bit of advice, to optimize your wealth, you should primarily reside in a country other than that from which you hold your first passport, while keeping the bulk of your money in yet a third jurisdiction, probably a tax haven. Three-flag strategy, essentially.
So there you have it, a whirlwind tour of Davidson and Rees-Mogg's central thesis. The information age drives the decline of the nation-state, the rise of the sovereign individual, and just a fundamental shift in how power, wealth, and society are organized.
Certainly a lot to process, isn't it? A very provocative book, even decades later. But here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Considering these predictions were made back in the late 1990s, how much of this apocalyptic unveiling, as they called it, do you see actually unfolding today?
Yeah, what new forms of social organization or individual autonomy are emerging right now that challenge our traditional notions of citizenship and governance? And maybe most importantly, what implications does any of this have for your own future?